In this video, we are going to be focused on the full backstitch. The full backstitch, when we look at it from this side, is going to look like a solid line. On the other side, which would be the interior of your fabric, we stitch this one from the right side of the fabric. This is going to have this spots where, as you can see, it is sort of doubled over. So we have threads here and we have a single thread here. So our threads are sort of doubled in every spot. As you can imagine, this stitch is a very strong stitch because we are basically stitching over every section twice. So in theory, this is one of those stitches that you can use when you're hand stitching together a seam or something that needs a little bit extra support when you're hand sewing. It is also a good temporary stitch if you ever find yourself needing to do a quick hand stitch repair to create what looks like a machine stitch from the exterior. And so I would use this for that kind of stitch as well. This is based off of an embroidery stitch, so you do find this in embroidery as well. So with this stitch, we are going to be sewing through 2 layers of fabric. And I've already marked the muslin with a light blue line so that we can see our stitching on top of that. And that's just a guideline for us as we're stitching along. The other thing that I have already prepped for us is I'm sewing with a 10mm needle. You can use a whatever needle is most comfortable for you. A 9 sharp is a great needle for beginners. I've also already preconditioned this with thread conditioner, also called Thread Heaven, and that is just so that my thread doesn't knot as I'm sewing. So that has already been all prepped. Now, one of the things that we're going to do with this, and I'm going to go ahead and mark this just for a guideline for us. I'm going to use my ruler, and I am going to mark every half, let's do 3/8 of an inch. So we're going to do a mark here, here, here. Now this is just to be a guideline for us as we're sewing today. It is not necessary to do this when you are actually stitching this for real. You can eyeball it, and that is completely acceptable when we are sewing. So you can see I've marked every 3/8 of an inch. Your stitch can be bigger or smaller. Generally, I wouldn't go bigger for a permanent stitch. I would rather go smaller, maybe every 1/4 inch, but I'm going to keep it on a little bit on the big side just so that we have a easy guideline. So that has been marked every 3/8 of an inch. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to knot my thread. So wrapping it around my finger, you can roll it off, or you can basically wind it through the loop a couple of times and pull that tight. And then we're going to trim off our tail. So we have a very long tail. We're going to trim that. We want to keep the tail very short so that it doesn't allow the knot to slip off. And we are going to hide our tail. So going between my 2 layers, I am going to pull this up, and I'm going to come to my second mark here. It's important that I start at the second mark, not the first mark. So you can see here I have my thread here. Now I'm going to come back 3/8 of an inch. I'm going to turn this so that I can handle it. So I'm going to come back 3/8 of an inch, and I'm going to be pulling my needle out forward 3/8 of an inch. So when you're doing a full back stitch, your thread is always going to be halfway between where you've gone under and where you're coming out. Now I come back to where my thread was before, and I come forward a full 3/8 of an inch. And then I come back and I go forward. And we are just going to keep repeating this as we go along. So whenever you come out, you should always have a space equal between here and here that is equal to each stitch length. Now when I come back, and this is hence the reason why it's called a back stitch, is we've gone back and then we go forward. When you look at this on the other side, you can see here this is where my thread was from the previous stitch. So every stitch has a double layer of thread. So we're just going to continue this. You want to make sure you're not pulling too tight, which could cause the fabric to pucker. You also want to make sure that you're not getting any knots in your thread, which tends to happen a little bit more in the back stitch as you are multiplying the number of threads on the back side. So just be aware, and if you need to, just pull your fabric back and you will see that it is not getting looped or knotted on the back side. So we are going to finish our stitch here. And ideally, we're trying to make this as straight of a line as possible. Now, because my stitches are a little bit bigger than I probably would normally do, normally I'd be around 1/4 of an inch, but as a result, that means that the stitch line is going to actually look a little bit more wavy. The longer your stitches, the more segmented your line is going to look, and the more then it has a tendency to not look as straight. If you are really needing a really straight line, a shorter, smaller stitch length is always going to be your friend. This is true anytime we're working around curves and corners as well. So long stitching will make things look more rectilinear and less curvilinear. We're almost done here. I'm going to just do my last couple stitches. Again, this is a very strong stitch. It's best used for hand sewing when we need something that's got the strength of a machine stitch, but we maybe don't have access to a machine. Or it's possible you might not be able to get the machine in where you're trying to get it in. Now on this last stitch, you can see I don't have enough fabric to go any further. So I'm just actually going to take a regular stitch coming out where I was before. And then I'm going to make a knot. So I'm going to take a very small stitch right next to where my thread has come out. And then I'm going to take the tail of my thread and I'm going to wrap it around that needle a couple of times. Pull it tight to the base of the needle. And then I'm going to pull that up, creating a knot right at that point, a very small knot. And then I always recommend that you stitch again one layer. Now this stitch, I've gone between my layers, so you can see it's not actually coming through to the back side. It's between my 2 layers. And I'm just going to take a regular stitch. This allows my knot to get pulled very tight to the fabric so it doesn't create an extra lump. And the tail is hidden and protected. So I'm going to trim that. And if I pull that out, my tail then goes into between my layers and it's nice and smooth there. So this is a full back stitch, and you can see that it looks like a solid double line on the back side.